Hi, everybody. Welcome to a very different event from Global Encounters this week. I'm very glad that many of you could make it tonight, and hopefully a few more people will join us as we go along. As always, I begin by acknowledging that we meet and indeed write, perform, and live on the unceded lands of the Kulin people of Naarm, which we now know as Melbourne, and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Tonight's event comes out of a conference presentation that the three of us gave at the Royal Anthropological Institute back in the days of COVID. And we had a tiny audience, a very, very tiny audience. So someone is just saying, coming to us from Darkinong country. Welcome. Thank you. I shall just turn that off for now. So yes, it was a tiny audience at this RAI event. I think to reference Philip Adams, for those of you who are old enough to remember Philip Adams, we had our very own lonely Gladys in the audience, or an audient rather than an audience. But tonight we're going to talk about the future and encounters in science fiction. So we can go to the next couple of slides, David. I seem to be stuck on one slide. There we go. So my talk is actually entitled "The Future is Native: The Role of Colonialism, Indigenism, and the Future," particularly on Star Trek Next Generation and beyond. A lot of this comes out of a lifelong love of all things Star Trek, and it builds on work that I did a number of years ago with colleague Nathan Wolski. I, like many of you, belong to what I consider to be the Apollo generation. We grew up literally with the Apollo journeys, NASA, and I think Star Trek in lots of ways played a really formidable and formative role in that process as well. So we can go one more and two more actually. So Star Trek is perhaps one of the greatest consumption phenomena of our time. The science fiction series has been hailed as the most successful and lucrative cult phenomena in television history. Exemplifying a cultural phenomena, Star Trek fans, and of which I am very much one, run the gamut from commonplace mainstream viewers to highly devoted members of an alternative subculture. Over the past 6 decades, through those various series that you can see there, the phenomena of Star Trek has become, to use Bernardi's term, a megatext. Star Trek's megatext consists of much more than the various studio-produced films and television series. It also includes, among other things, novels, internet chat groups, conventions, and fan scenes. Next slide, please, David.
That's right.
That Star Trek's premise of space exploration is a thinly disguised metaphor for colonialism has been extensively analysed by myself and Nathan Wolski, but also by Bernardi, Hastie, Ono, Richards, and many others. Boyd describes the utopian future presented in Star Trek: The Next Generation in particular as based on a 19th century essentialist definition of human nature, building on faith in perfection, progress, and social evolution, and free will. Exploration and colonisation and assimilation are never far from the surface of Star Trek. Star Trek has always been contentious and political. In the future, there will be no hunger, there will be no greed. All children will know how to read. All children will live in harmony. It's important to think that when we talk about Star Trek, or indeed any science fiction and colonialist underpinnings, it's worthwhile thinking that just a little over 200 years ago, the aliens arrived in our country and they didn't go away. In the very heavy-handed, Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. Next slide, please, David. Thank you. Which aired in January 1969, Nichelle Nichols, who you might know as Uhura, described that the episode was inspired by the race riots and the death of Martin Luther King in the previous year. Next slide, please. The so-called first ever interracial kiss, which took place in Plato's Stepchildren, was broadcast in November 22, 1968. What's interesting is, although many people will tell you this is the first interracial kiss that was ever shown on television or on any screen, in fact, it was not the case. And in fact, a British television series had shown an interracial kiss some 4 years earlier. The diversity and evolution of Star Trek is a point that I'm going to return to later on. Next slide, please. And add the next one, please. Thank you. So Star Trek is built on the premise of first contact, encounters, as it were. The central thematic of Star Trek is the exploration of uncharted territory. It is the frontier to which the United Federation of Planets is committed to mapping. Beyond the frontier, there be aliens. The Prime Directive, officially Starfleet Order Number 1, is a prohibition on interference with other cultures and civilizations or representatives of Starfleet. The Starfleet encountered these people these creatures, these aliens, on their exploration of the universe. In particular, the Prime Directive is aimed at preventing interference with the internal development of civilizations that are less technologically advanced than the Starfleet are. The executive study of the order is given in the episode from 1968, Breads and Circuses. It says, no identification of self or mission, no interference with social development of said planet, no reference to space or other worlds or other advanced civilizations. However, as any Star Trek fan knows, mention of the Prime Directive invariably means that it's about to be violated. Next slide, please. This mapping, the process of making the known unknown, is a fundamental component of the colonial project. This image you see here is from the movie called First Contact, which is the moment at which the Vulcans first encounter Earth, and of course the Prime Directive has already been violated. The Federation, with its mission to seek out new life and new civilization, has parallels with the European exploration and colonising missions of the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. The centrality of this mission is a pillar of the Star Trek canon. The most recent iteration of Star Trek, Strange New Worlds, in particular pays homage to the original series, opening lines with the 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilization, and to boldly go where no man, although more politically correct now, no one, has gone before. Next slide, please. Space, uncharted and unknown, does not exist until the Federation charts it, maps it, names it, and ultimately controls it. Once colonised, the unfamiliar becomes familiar and is assimilated into the social structure that is the United Federation of Planets. Although the Federation is committed to a colonialist project, it is not without a self-critique and self-reflection. Elsewhere, I've described the Borg in particular as a post-colonial mirror held up to reflect the nature of colonisation and assimilation. I think the next slide, please, David. And the next one, please. Thank you. The Borg function as a post-colonial space in which the writers review the foundational narratives and the limits of their own perspectives. The colonising and assimilation functions of the Federation and the colonising and assimilation functions of the Borg are inverse reflections of one another. In reading the Borg this way, I actually think that Star Trek Next Generation's progressive thinking never quite reaches the level of questioning its own authority. In fact, the Borg become the chief vehicle through which the ideas of self and other and difference and sameness are explored. The Borg function as a prism through which the colonial gaze of the Federation is redirected, and in doing so, it's intensified. The Borg are a race of enhanced humanoids implanted with cybernetic devices which are both internal and external to their bodies, as you can see in this slide. The Borg are initially represented to be both completely homogeneous and other to the Federation. The humanoid body exists as a blank slate onto which technological modifications are made. The body's integrity is disregarded. It matters not whether the body is that of a human, a Klingon, a Vulcan, or any other alien or being. All humanoid creatures are, in fact, the potential resources for the Borg collection, which becomes a multiracial mass. Visible transformations such as the insertion of tubes the addition of artificial limbs and prosthetic eyes, define the Borg as non-human. Each Borg is tied to a subspace communication network, which constitutes a homogeneous synthesized whole that the Borg is the Borg collective. Free will, self-determination, and choices are easily removed as easily as the artificial body parts are installed. The Borg are entirely alien, lacking the possibility of individual self-determination. However, more recent iterations, next slide please, of the Borg, as depicted in the most recent seasons of the series Picard, suggests an evolution that in many ways represents the evolution of the Star Trek universe more generally. The biggest change to the Borg just happened on Star Trek Picard when the Queen Borg, from an alternate 2400, goes back in time to the 21st century, and she takes over the consciousness of a human scientist, Agnes Jurati, who's also from the year 2400. After a mental tug of war between both minds, the Borg Queen sublimates Jurati's consciousness, and ultimately Jurati's stronger personality surfaces and reasserts itself. Jurati and the Borg Queen eventually share a body. They create a new Borg collective, one that does not forcibly assimilate people, but will embrace the distinctiveness and individuality of its collective. A hive mind still, but one which embraces individual minds within it. Assimilation wouldn't come from attacks, but is from those who voluntarily join the collective, or those who are found injured or dying in space and are then taken in. What we learn in the Picard Season 2 finale is that the secondary Borg collective grew 400 years ago. In the year 2400, Agnes is still Borg Queen, and the new Borg Queen has created this collective that doesn't forcibly assimilate. Instead, when they join the Starfleet to stop a destructive spatial anomaly, they formally request membership of the Federation. For those of us that know and love Star Trek: The Next Generation, the idea of the Borg joining the Federation seems completely at odds with what we would expect. When a mysterious transwarp conduit forms in space from an entirely unknown and, shall we ask, enemy alien species, the Borg offer to be the guardians at the gate. The Borg occupy a liminal space in which questions of self and otherness, difference and sameness are played out. The Borg episodes allow series to reflect on the ways in which the self can come to know other, and how that can change that distinction between self and other. The old paradigm of the dominating colonizer and the passive native or other has been called into question. In its place of this unproblematic colonial relationship where the self and other understood as stable and unitary, and where the authority of the self is unchallenged, there comes an understanding that ambiguity and the fracture lie at the very source of colonial power. As Homi Bhabha would remind us, it is mimicry and the role of the hybrid that serves to disrupt the colonial power and fracture the colonial relationship. Another Star Trek moment, next slide please. In another Star Trek moment, it's found in an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, Journey's End. This is the last episode that involved, well, one of the last episodes involved the character Wesley Crusher. In the episode, Wesley Crusher questions the very constitution of his reality as it is defined by the Federation's colonial project. Crusher articulates the colonial dilemma to interfere or to leave the other alone. In this instance, a situation complicated by the military structure of the Federation. As long as he wears a Federation uniform, he recognises that he needs to follow Federation rules. As long as he wears that uniform, he is not free to choose a counter-hegemony. In Journey's End, a group of Native Americans, or future Native Americans, are relocated from their planet as part of a treaty that has been signed between the Federation and the Cardassians. The Indians, as they are referred to in this episode, are instructed to move. The Federation orders this on the grounds that their relocation will, quote, serve the greater good. Notions of greater good and the sacrifices made by a few in order to serve the majority are commonly encountered in colonial history. Invariably, the sacrifices are asked and, in fact, demanded of the natives, and they do not so of the colonial power. Removal of Indigenous people onto reservations and missions have lengthy and checkered histories, and this is one but many examples. In Journey's End, the natives, the Indians, are described as having left Earth to preserve their cultural identity, and despite their relocation, they are described as both American and Indian, led by an elder known as Anthoro, and they refuse to comply with the Federation's orders. Relocation is not possible. Their new home holds deep spiritual significance. They will not leave it. As the elder says, we must hold on to what we have, even against overwhelming opposition. As negotiations proceed, Crusher, the young Starfleet Academy cadet who has spent his entire life within the Federation, begins to doubt the validity of the Federation's actions. As a Starfleet cadet, Crusher symbolises the progression of science and the importance of Federation's ideals. However, he begins to question his place in the Academy and the Federation. In seeking those answers, and he joins a vision quest where he sees his deceased father. But in seeking those answers, he challenges the captain, Picard, and says, what you're doing down there is wrong. These people are not some random group of colonists. They're a unique culture with a history that predates the Federation and Starfleet. It is surely not a coincidence that the episode entitled Journey's End features the clash of those two cultural systems between dispossessor and dispossessed. But whose journey is it that's ending? Is it just Wesley's? Or is it perhaps the colonialist mission of the Enterprise and indeed Starfleet that is going to end? The traveller tells Wesley that he is now able to pull himself outside of time, and in that moment, he can move beyond the colonial construction of his identity. If the Borg offered us a post-colonial moment, then Crusher's engagement with native culture and natural development, which is seen in a number of other episodes, which I've spoken about at length elsewhere, this makes us realise that the integral part of Star Trek's future is to begin to question the boundaries between the other and them, us and other. But these also fall out and these begin to play out around AI, artificial life, genetic enhancement, and augmentation. In the 24th century, we know that there has been a eugenics war. Next slide, please, which has involved Khan Noonien Sung, an augmented humanoid who has a connection to Data yet to be revealed. In the episode The Mismeasure of Man, Data is put on trial to determine whether or not he is sentient. It's a really important episode and one I urge everybody to watch. Data is an android. He knows he's an android. He is constantly seeking to improve himself. He seeks ways to emulate humanity. He's very much the 24th century Pinocchio. His sentience is determined in the episode, and he is presented from being deconstructed. But later in the series, next slide, please, Date creates a daughter, Lal, who, though only short-lived, sets up a precedent for Adam Sung's synthetic daughters, Daj, Soji, and Kor. Using terms like lived, live, synthetic, life form, artificial life, and so on, I think there's some wriggle room, suggesting that there's no distinct boundaries between AI, AL, synthetic life, and other. Daj and Soji in the 24th century and Kor in the 21st century do not realise that they are not human, unlike Data, who always knew he was not human. There appears to be an ancestral connection, according to the Picard storyline. Next slide, please. After Soji, next one, please. After Soji deletes Adam Sung's computer files and thus destroys all of his electronically stored research material, he opens a drawer and pulls out what is presumably his last piece of work, an old paper file, next slide, labelled Project Khan. Next slide. We can assume that he will use this to begin a new line of research. And of course, the rest is history. For many of us would know that one of the very earliest films is actually Project Khan. It's deeply satisfying to see the connections between the synthetic life forms, colonialism, and autonomy being tied in a neat bow when the final episode of Picard, and you can go back at one, please, David. And when the final episode of Picard, Wesley Crusher returns following the success of the Europa mission and foiling Adam Sung's plot to create the Confederation of the Earth timeline. Wesley approaches Kor Sung and offers to take her on gives her a choice. She can take her through an ordinary life, or she can take a different path, one that will lead to, quote, everything else. Star Trek continues to evolve and develop both as a television series and as a mirror to contemporary society. In simple ways, it has exerted tremendous influence, from flip phones designed to look and feel like communicators to a universal translator in Google Translate, to the holodeck in VR and AR, to voice-activated computers like Siri. In the recent iteration of Discovery, set in the 32nd century, the sentience of Data, Daj, and others is extended to the ship's computer, who's developed consciousness and even names themselves Zora. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to David now.
Okay. Hi. Lynette and Leonie, if you see anyone entering the waiting
Yes.
room, can you let them in, please?
Will do.
Okay. 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 So, in my paper, I'm going to look at the history of encounters between global indigenous peoples and the space opera franchise Star Wars. So, in other words, I'm not really looking at fictional depictions of encounters between different species or contact between different planets. Rather, I'm looking at the various real-world interactions and exchanges that First Nations people have had with the Star Wars franchise and how these have changed over time. So I would contend that these interactions and exchanges cohere into three distinct stories, or as one might say, three episodes. In the process of exploring these three episodes, I'm also trying to adhere to one of the central principles of the Global Encounters project, which is the importance of looking at encounters from both sides, from the perspectives of outsiders looking in and insiders looking out, the view from the ship and the view from the shore. So the first part of my paper looks at what the early Star Wars films took from First Nations cultures, while the second part explores how First Nations artists and creators have responded to and identified with Star Wars. Then in the third part, I combine these perspectives by looking at the increasing number of First Nations creators who are working within Star Wars and how they're changing and adding to the franchise. So when George Lucas made the original Star Wars trilogy, released between 1977 and 1983, he drew inspiration from a range of cinematic influences, including 1930s pulp sci-fi serials, westerns and spaghetti westerns, and the films of Akira Kurosawa. He also marshaled a dizzying array of cultural and historical references, visual motifs, spiritual beliefs, and bits of material culture pilfered from many indigenous cultures and more broadly from many non-Western and Western cultures around the globe. One of the more well-known examples of this is, of course, Princess Leia's iconic hairstyle in Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. This is often described as a reference to or appropriation of the squash blossom hairstyle worn by unmarried women of the Hopi people in Arizona, as depicted in this photo from 1906 by Edward Curtis. But the story is a bit more convoluted. So in a 2002 interview with Time magazine, George Lucas claims that he was actually inspired by the hairstyle of female revolutionaries in the Mexican Revolution. Now, this is a Hopi hairstyle, and female Mexican revolutionaries were not known to wear this hairstyle. However, we do know that at least one Mexican revolutionary, Clara de la Rocha, wore this hairstyle in a photograph. And we know that George Lucas has seen the photograph because this copy is held in his costuming archive at Skywalker Ranch. What we don't know is how this Mexican revolutionary came to be wearing a Hopi hairstyle, but this would appear to be the source image for Leia's iconic hair. Other examples of Star Wars drawing on indigenous cultures include the Tusken Raiders or Sand People on the desert planet Tatooine, whose appearance was partly modeled after the Bedouin people of northern Africa. The Tusken's weapon, the Gaffy Stick, was modeled after the wooden Fijian war club called a totokia. Additionally, Lucas named the Ewoks from the forest moon of Endor after the Miwok people, who are indigenous to the redwood forests where the Endor scenes were filmed. It would be instructive here, I think, to compare the Tuscans and the Ewoks. So both species are depicted as somewhat primitive, but in vastly different ways. The Ewoks conforming to the noble savage type, somewhat gullible and superstitious, but still bravely helping to defeat the Empire's technologically superior forces, while the Tusken Raiders are depicted in the original trilogy as brutal, violent savages, and are described in the prequel trilogy as vicious, mindless monsters. But probably the most iconic and well-known character design in the Star Wars franchise is that of Darth Vader. And while it's been suggested that Darth Vader's mask and helmet were modeled after African mask traditions, they're actually primarily based on the kabuto, a Japanese samurai helmet, and the mempo, a mask used to protect the samurai's face. Specifically, they were inspired by the black lacquer armor worn by a 17th century daimyo named Data Masamune, also known as the One-Eyed Dragon of Oshu. As suggested, this installation, which was displayed at the Linden Museum in Stuttgart in 2015, the mask is one of the defining, if not the definitive, visual motif of the Star Wars franchise. Sometimes an actor's face will be masked as part of their costume, like the actors who portray Ewoks or Wookiees or droids. And the many puppets used throughout the franchise can be thought of as extensions of this, since they too keep the human performer veiled or invisible. So, but there are also many masks and face coverings within the actual fictional universe of Star Wars. So the masks and hoods worn by stormtroopers, Tusken Raiders, Jawas. Many of the human characters are also masked at some point in the franchise. Off the top of my head, I can recall scenes in which Luke, Leia, Obi-Wan, Palpatine, Lando, Rey, Finn, Kylo, Din Djarin, and obviously Boba Fett and Darth Vader all hide their faces behind either masks, helmets, or hoods. I also think it's significant that many of the kinship relationships between major characters are, in a sense, masked until the plot reaches a climactic moment of revelation or unmasking. How can we explain this focus on masking and unmasking? It's fairly well known that in creating Star Wars, Lucas drew inspiration from Joseph Campbell's concept of the hero's journey, developed in The Hero with a Thousand Faces. This is the idea that every mythical hero story across cultures and throughout history is merely a version of a single universal story. So in other words, the distinguishing features of any one story are nothing more than a mask hiding the true face of the monomyth. Not only does the mask represent the 1,000 different faces of the hero's journey, it also figures really deeply in Lucas's conception of the Force. Lucas was inspired to develop the concept of the Force by a line in the Canadian filmmaker Arthur Lipsek's abstract montage collage film from 1963 titled 2187. One of the audio sources that Lipsek sampled for the film was a conversation between artificial intelligence pioneer Warren S. McCulloch and a cinematographer called Roman Krotor, who went on to develop IMAX. As part of this audio sample, Krotor states that, here I'm quoting, "Many people feel that in the contemplation of nature and in communication with other living things, they become aware of some kind of force or something behind this apparent mask which we see in front of us, and they call it God." So that's the line that kind of inspired Lucas's conception of the Force. And within this concept of the Force, it's not just that every story or every hero's journey is a mask, but everything we see around us, nature, other life forms, the whole of perceptible reality, is nothing more than a mask for the Force. So in this way, the preponderance of masks in Star Wars is not just a visual motif or a purely aesthetic element, but like one of its organizing principles. However, an obvious problem with Campbell's monomyth theory is that when every story is just a version of a single universal archetype, there's a flattening of any sense of difference, distinction, or cultural specificity. As the folklorist Donald J. Cosentino writes quite wittily, it is just as important to stress differences as similarities, to avoid creating a Campbell soup of myths that loses all local flavor. And since Lucas was so deeply influenced by Campbell's concept of the hero's journey, does this mean that Star Wars constitutes or reconstitutes Campbell's flavorless soup of myths? While I might be somewhat biased as a child of the 80s, I don't think the hero's journey in the original Star Wars trilogy is lacking in flavor or distinctiveness. And here is what I think is a bit of a paradox of Star Wars, at least the original trilogy. By drawing on such a wide range of cultural and historical references, it is both deeply archetypal, but also highly idiosyncratic. So having looked at what the Star Wars films have taken from First Nations cultures, I'm now going to explore how First Nations creators have responded to and identified with Star Wars. So in the 4 decades since the original trilogy was released, the films have resonated deeply with many global Indigenous artists and creators, particularly in North America and Oceania. These artists often reclaim and subvert the visual iconography of Star Wars to tell stories of Indigenous resistance and resilience, as exemplified here in a work from 2018 titled Resistance by the Comox artist Andy Everson from Canada's West Coast. A significant moment in the relationship between global Indigenous peoples and Star Wars occurred in 2014, when the Star Wars film A New Hope became the first feature film to be dubbed in the Navajo or Diné language. The project was spearheaded by Manuelito Wheeler, director of the Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock, Arizona. The film, known as Navajo Star Wars, premiered in July 2014 at a rodeo arena in Window Rock, to a cheering audience of over 2,000 mostly Navajo people. It has been screened several times since then. Here, the voice cast is reunited at a screening celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the film. And in 2024, A New Hope also became the first feature film to be dubbed in the Ojibwe language, premiering last August in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Both the Navajo and Ojibwe language versions are available to watch on Disney+. They're listed as extras under the original film. And together, I think these projects harness the enduring influence and intergenerational appeal of Star Wars in order to support the resilience and preservation of Indigenous languages. Another significant moment in the relationship between Indigenous peoples and Star Wars occurred in 2019, with the opening of an exhibition at the Museum of Northern Arizona called The Force is with Our People. Running from October 2019 to May 2020, the exhibition showcased a wide range of Star Wars-inspired art by Native American artists from across Southwest USA, including this piece by popular artist Mike Toyer titled Maiden Leia, which reappropriates Leia's squash blossom hairstyle. Some works in the exhibition use Native American traditions of beadwork and pottery to depict the iconography of Star Wars, but many works combine Star Wars and Native American iconographies, such as this piece by DNA artist Ryan Singer titled Sand People, Sand Painting. This mishmash of imagery provides us with a glimpse into a strange alternate reality that cannot be firmly located in either the American Southwest or in a galaxy far, far away. As the curator Anthony Thibodeau writes in his catalog essay, these artists are essentially creating an alternate universe where Star Wars is reimagined as an Indigenous story. Thibodeau also notes that only 2 works were commissioned for the exhibition, which means that the exhibition is documenting the phenomenon of Star Wars-inspired Native American art rather than causing the phenomenon. One of the 2 commissioned works was Hopi R2, Hopi Tewa artist Dwayne Koyowena, alongside engineer Joe Mastroianni. And since 2023, Hopi R2 has also featured in a traveling exhibition titled The Return of the Force, which serves as a sequel to the 29 exhibition. So why has Star Wars resonated so deeply with many global First Nations artists and creators? Well, Star Wars is one of the most influential and enduring pieces of pop culture from the last 40 years. So on one level, It's popular with Indigenous people because it's popular with everyone. But on another level, at its heart, Star Wars is a story about resistance to tyranny and imperialism, and the belief that all living things are connected. And so many Indigenous artists find parallels and resonances between these themes and their own histories and traditions. Take, for instance, this work, again by Ryan Singer, titled Decolonized Ewok. Singer's artist statement in the exhibition catalogue states that the depicted Ewok symbolizes a native child taken from his Indigenous homelands and turned into what the colonizer expected. Now, I only really have dot points to go, but before I move on to my third point, I'm just going to go through a few Australian artists who have also engaged with Star Wars. So here we have Tony Albert, a Yurime Yidiji and Kuku Yalanji artist who has a series called The Force is With Us. So this is The Force is With Us #1, and this is The Force is With Us #5. Then we have Torres Strait Islander artist Brian Robinson, who you can see some Star Wars iconography in there, sort of drawing parallels between European exploration and settlements and sci-fi invasion narratives. And here we have The Stolen Child by Aidan Hartshawn, a Walgaloo and Rodri artist. And this is taking the character of the foundling child from the TV series The Mandalorian and drawing parallels between that character and the Australian Indigenous experience of the Stolen generation. So I'm just going to end with a little quick thing. Throughout this talk, I've kind of talked about Star Wars and, First Nations people as if they're separate entities, one producing and one responding. But recent and upcoming entries to the Star Wars franchise invoke notions of Indigenous Futurisms through marshalling of Indigenous directors, authors, and performers. So most notably in the recent Disney Plus TV series, The Mandalorian and the Book of Boba Fett, Maori actor Tamura Morrison has taken the role of Boba Fett and reshaped it by incorporating Maori concepts, traditions, combat techniques, and as we can see here, Pacifica weapons into his performance. So Morrison has said, I come from the Maori nation of New Zealand, the Indigenous people, we're the Down Under Polynesians, and I wanted to bring that kind of spirit and energy, which we call warua. I've been trained in my cultural dance, which we call the haka. I've also been trained in some of our weapons. So that's how I was able to manipulate some of the weapons in my fight scenes and work with the gaffy stick, which my character has. And along similar lines, there's a character in The Acolyte played by the Filipino-Canadian actor Manny Jacinto. And that character's fighting style is inspired by traditional Filipino fighting styles. So there isn't, rather than thinking of Star Wars and Indigenous people as separate entities, Indigenous people are within Star Wars creating it. And that too is having another effect on the art. So this artist, Graham Hoyter, after the broadcast of the Book of Boba Fett, he presented Tamura Morrison with this carved helmet of Boba Fett's character, and they did a haka dance together. And so yeah, it's this nice kind of a call and response between Star Wars and Indigenous cultures. And that's it.
Over to Leonie.
Okay. Look, that's a very hard act to follow, but I shall try. First off, next slide, please, David. Thanks. I'm speaking to you from Jajak, Bendigo on Dja Dja Wurrung country. And I want to acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge far-flung friends who are here today, Fikri and Abi, who are in Macassar, and Shelley, who's come to us all the way from the other side of the planet. So welcome. I was born on Wurundjeri land, a few kilometres to the south of where events in this painting that you see took place. where a consortium of pastoral land speculators from Tasmania attempted a treaty with Kulin representatives in 1835. This conceives of a kindlier invasion than what occurred in Sydney in 1788 and in Hobart in 1803, but it became an invasion nonetheless, and within 4 years, the catastrophe of settler colonialism was firmly entrenched. Within a generation, the Kulin and other First Nations of this part of the continent were pushed to the brink of extinction by frontier violence and disease, but the Kulin and other nations survived and thrived. This land was never ceded. Okay, next, David, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to speak about 3 main ideas today. Alien invasion as a metaphor for colonisation, which, Lynette has spoken a little bit about. The mycelial network in Star Trek Discovery, and rethinking encounters. And I want to make the point before we go any further that I'm not now, nor have I ever been, a Star Trek scholar, nor a mycologist. I'm just an ethnographic historian who was once a novelist. I'm someone who did a PhD on the Tasmanian genocide, when First Nations peoples fought invasion, were ethnically cleansed to an island, then became political activists to ensure their survival. Right, next, Dave. Yeah. Right, so alien invasion as a metaphor for colonisation. Next, please. So this is a concept which will probably be familiar to you. H.G. Wells famously was inspired by British colonisation of Tasmania and what he perceived as the racial extinction of First Nations peoples there to write War of the Worlds. Next. And he writes in his introduction, are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit? I have to admit, I was a little bit slow on the uptake. I only fully understood the use of this alien invasion metaphor when I was doing my PhD on the ethnic cleansing and exile of Palawa people. I found myself seriously addicted to alien invasion and zombie apocalypse films. Often, the more B-grade, the better. It was my way of making sense of what I was reading in a historiography that was dominated by doomed race thinking. Like H.G. Wells, that some peoples are destined to fall in the face of greater forces. It's endemic in Australian history writing up until the 1970s and persists throughout Western culture still. You'll all have your own favourites and variations. In the movie adaptation of the Hasbro game Battleship, in an early scene, the astronomer says, next, David. If there's intelligent life out there and they come here, it's going to be like Columbus and the Indians, only we're the Indians. And this was the idea, the myth that H.G. Wells bought into. The idea of Tasmanian racial extinction was pretty fresh when Wells first learned of it, less than 2 decades in the making. But of course, and next, it was completely fictive. The ethnic cleansing was never total. Palawa people were always there, on the mainland, in surrounding islands, in faraway lands, and at sea. They were certainly pushed to the brink, like the people in many other locations around Australia. But in the last census in 2021, for example, over 30,000 people identified as Palawa. So the extinction myth is just that, a fictive creation that has taken on, for many, the mantle of fact. Next, please. So when I was doing my PhD, and in the years since, I admit, I have a great interest in alien invasion tropes. B-list Hollywood does a great job of exploring the variations. Alien invaders bent on water extraction, like in Battle Los Angeles, or mineral extraction in The Darkest Hour. In these 2 films, it is sabotaging this extraction process and the means of communication, which marks the resistance. Next. There was also a truly awesome alien invasion in a film called Occupation, which happened during that most Australian event, the football game, an Aussie rules game. It's a very silly film, but worth it for the alien attack at the footy scene and Tamura Morrison, David. And Tamura Morrison is actually in a sequel to Occupation too. Next, thanks. So the zombie variation of the invasion narrative is a way I, as a non-Indigenous person in the 21st century, could begin to try and understand what must have been the lived present for the people whose work I was trying to understand. Early on, I read Kutcher Risling Baldy's blog post. It's an absolute masterpiece, and I really recommend hunting this down, where she discusses The Walking Dead, using The Walking Dead to teach First Nations history. This piece is written in 2014, so early Walking Dead, for context. Tapping into Lawrence Gross's idea of post-apocalypse stress syndrome, Baldy writes that California Indians often refer to the mission system and the gold rush as, and I quote, the end of the world. What those who survived experienced was both the apocalypse and post-apocalypse. It was nothing short of zombies running around trying to kill them. And Baldy invites the reader to assume the position of Carl, the young boy who's just seen his world destroyed. Next, please. In standard mainstream alien invasion scenarios, like with colonialism in general, there's usually two strands. And Lynette has spoken about this much more eloquently than I could. Resource extraction, where the invader leaves at least part of the Indigenous population in place to take tribute, establish agriculture, work mines, etc. Or settler colonialism, which is predicated on dispossession and erasure of the Indigenous population. The Borg present a different, nuanced version, a Star Trek in-house critique of colonialist assimilation policies. And as Lynette has written, the Borg serve as a post-colonial mirror, held up to reflect the nature of colonisation and assimilation. And in that way, they're equally or more terrifying, I think, because they're colonising not just the land, but the mind. Next, please. But in the end, no matter what the mode, settler, extractive or Borg, colonialism is based on what Greg Denning called the violence of contact, which is universal in its carelessness. And I think we can definitely include elements of Star Trek's motto set in Seeking Out New Life, boldly going into Denning's ideas about the violence of uninvited contact, exploration, boldly going, etc., etc. Even with the prime directive in place, it was arguably all violence all the time. Next, please. All of which brings me to Star Trek Discovery and the Mycelium Network and the agency of non-humanoid life. Next, please. And I'm not going to talk about beef Wellingtons for Australian people. So mycelium is an interesting metaphor for relationality in history research. The networks run beneath our feet, beneath the soil, linked over vast distances and arguably show decision-making and possibly short-term memory. The image at the bottom here of the trees in the underground reminds me in a way of the way Indigenous networks were often hidden from the eyes of colonisers. Time and time again, when you read explorer or coloniser or missionary texts, they're blind to the way news, ideas, goods, technology or spiritual principles travel between nations. Next, please. So in the Star Trek canon, for those unfamiliar, this all takes place a decade before the events of the first Star Trek series with Kirk, Spock, etc. And in fact, Gene Roddenberry modelled the original Star Trek on the exploratory voyages of Captain James Cook. I even have a theory that Kirk is Cook with a Yorkshire accent. So, maybe a linguist can help me out with that. The Cliff Notes. A spaceship, the Discovery, piloted by humanoids, uses what is called a displacement-activated spore hub drive. This accesses an invisible network which runs across space and between dimensions to travel from one point in the universe to another in seconds. It must be used by one person plugging in as a conduit or interface. And in fact, the human interface is, and you can see him in the bottom right-hand image, Paul Stamets, named after real-life mycologist Paul Stamets. To the humanoids, it's a miraculous discovery. It's going to change the face of space travel significantly. But by the time Kirk and Spock in the Enterprise are on their 5-year mission, there's no knowledge or record of the spore drive. So why did Discovery stop using the spore drive? And why is it erased from all memory? Next, please. Well, the mycelium network is alive, and each interaction is damaging the Jar-Sep, the beings who constitute it, leading to a catastrophic breakdown in their ecosystem. It's only when they assume a humanoid appearance, they send an emissary, and literally drag one of the Discovery crew into the network to witness the damage, that we become aware it's a life form. The viewer only sees it in its deteriorated form, and I think it's akin to the mass coral bleaching events that we have on the Barrier Reef here in Australia. The JARCEP want help defeating a monster which is wreaking this havoc. And in the end, this is found to be a presumed dead Discovery crew member who's both unwittingly attacking the JARCEP and being attacked by their immune system. But really, the monster is Discovery itself. So I'm neither a scholar of Star Trek or fungal networks. I'm a historian of colonial excess, of encounter, invasion, and genocide. But I can see in this narrative of the Discovery and the JARCEP an encounter which has played out between species. That is, people, animals, sea life, plants, water, and elements. It's an example of unwitting, accidental, contaminative colonialism. The idea that an element such as the mycelium network is there for the benefit and prosperity of humans, or humanoids, in their exploration and increase. This contaminative colonialism is present in settler colonialism, which is predicated on removal and dispossession of Indigenous species, and extractive colonialism, where the colonisers' administrative apparatus is superimposed on existing systems and used to exploit resources of land and sea. So the interaction of the Discovery and JARCEP isn't exactly the British ethnically cleansing Palawa people from Tasmania after sustained resistance, or the enslaved people from one continent being shipped to another continent to labour in mining or agriculture, or the spread, accidental or otherwise, of smallpox or other epidemics which devastated Indigenous societies which happen to have no immunity, or a mining giant like Rio Tinto destroying an archaeological site showing 40,000 years of continued occupation with what Patrick Wolfe might have called homicidal belligerence. Yet the Discovery's unwitting contaminative colonialism of the JARCEP's very being is an act of violence nonetheless, an invasion of JARCEP space and embodiment. Next, please. And now my final part, rethinking encounters. Next, please. So in our 5-year mission, I have to say, the Global Encounters project, one of our tasks is to develop typologies of encounters. Encounters are not the same as invasions. Encounters are often fleeting between parties who may never meet again. Sometimes they're violent, sometimes they're funny. So encounters between peoples, which is our number one focus, our proverbial bread and butter, or ship's biscuit and gravy. We've also looked at encounters involving animals, plants, waterways, and the sources we're looking at are, or using to explore these encounters are all sorts of different archives, oral histories, the spread of trees, rock art. We can investigate these encounters using a wide variety of traditional and non-traditional archival sources and gather and present data. But we're only looking at it from our temporal position, and we're often just getting an already contaminated view. Like if you only read secondary sources, you're only viewing through the lens of what that writer felt was important. To harken back to H.G. Wells and the Tasmanian example, the fact that so many people still believe Tasmanian Indigenous people are extinct is because their history is always read through the lens of the extinction myth. So what does this have to do with aliens, zombies, and fungal networks? And how do these tropes figure in our research? Next, please. So one of our goals is to re-present the past. As Greg Denning wrote, and I'm a huge Greg Denning fan, to give historical actors, whatever the species, a sense of agency. We need to try and imagine what it was like at their present, at the moment they saw giant sails 100 metres out offshore, or met smelly, bedraggled sailors on the beach, or encountered novel foods, technologies, and even sounds. And sounds is something I've been looking at recently because, especially on Matthew Flinder's circumnavigation of Australia, a few times they brought out the fife, the sort of the flute and drum, and tried to serenade First Nations people, and they always ran away, and they only came back when they'd stopped playing. We'll never really know what was going on in the heads of historical actors, of course. And as a middle-aged, middle-class, mainland white woman in the 21st century, I can never know the terror of the Black Line operation in Tasmania, or what it was like to see 90% of the people I knew suddenly get sick and die, like during the smallpox epidemic in Sydney in 1789. But fictionalised accounts give us a window into this, just a little bit. They can help us understand participants in historical encounters, not just as eventual coloniser and colonised, that view of the past which is contaminated by often problematic history writing, but as real people with complex emotional lives, hopes and fears, pasts and futures. Historical truths are ultimately unknowable, but an informed creative imagination can definitely enrich our meaning making, which is why I believe that reading or watching alien invasion or zombie narratives or sci-fi are a legitimate methodological approach to understanding the process of colonisation, colonialism and genocide. Do you get scared in those early parts of alien invasion or zombie narratives when suddenly everything you know and understand has collapsed and you're on the run from terrifying creatures? Good. Now you have a sense of being on the wrong side of settler colonial history. I should add I'm speaking to non-Indigenous people here. So it's only when Tilly, the Discovery crew member who's drawn into the jar-set world, that she and we can empathise and realise that the monster is in fact Discovery and us. Imagining ourselves in these situations takes us out of a pure data-driven, supposedly objective presentation of past events and gets us closer to a sense of what really might have been like for that person on that day in that place. So I want to take us back now to this image that I started with, the signing of the so-called Batman Treaty on the right here. This is one such nuanced encounter. But the Wurundjeri men of the Kulin Nation weren't necessarily awed by the arrival of white men. They would have known of their existence for decades. They'd have heard stories through their news networks, know runaway convicts, seen with their own eyes or heard from their neighbours about the white people who'd been scoping out Port Phillip Bay for decades or kidnapping Boonwurrung women. They knew they weren't alone in the universe. This painting is, of course, an attempt to create a foundation story for Melbourne, which at the time of its creation in, I think, 1875, 4 decades after this encounter, was already an extremely successful and wealthy city. Syphilitic John Batman didn't look like this. By this stage, as I understand it, his nose was almost completely gone. And the Wurundjeri didn't look like this. Their clothing is all wrong. The place where they met by Merry Creek probably didn't look like this either. But despite these limitations, it's a visual point of access where we can begin to apply our knowledge based on extensive research to gain a sense of what it might have been like for those people on that day in that place. And just to finish, I think that by using pop culture, especially simulations like invasion or apocalypse narratives, we achieve a more nuanced and complex reading of past events, encounters, and the workings of settler colonialism. Well, that's my excuse for watching Star Trek for work anyway, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Leonie. Fantastic. We've run right up to the hour, but I'm sure we could take a couple of questions if people had any or comments. I would say thank you to my colleagues for such wonderful papers, but also for sharing the passion of trying to think through historical phenomena in modern ways. We've got Jack's got something here. Oh, thank you, Jack. Thank you for a lovely for comment. And Natalie Pearson also had to go, but she said she thought it was a great session. So thank you.
Fikri has a question.
Fikri, where are we? Here he is.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Fikri.
Fikri.
Hi.
Fikri.
Oh, good. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me good?
Yep.
Yep, all good.
So I'm speaking from my land, Makassar, and this is a very interesting and also important presentation. So thank you, Lynette, David, and Leonie. Very, very interesting because this is the first time I attend a session or like an academic forum that's talking about pop culture, how we see indigenous resistance through pop culture. I think it's really important because it's sort of like how our roles as academics can give control to these, filmmakers that happen to be many of them from Hollywood, like my t-shirt that I bought from LA. So it's really, really interesting how we can contribute to the discourse, because sometimes I think if we keep doing this, it's gonna contribute a lot to the discussion about indigenous resistance, because maybe if none of the people from this field doing that, they can get away, with their colonial perspective, keep reproducing what they know about what I say with my American friend the other day as cinematic resistance. They use the concept of resistance, but from the colonial, white colonial POV point of view. So I think this is a really good interpretation, and also like an offer to us here about how we rethink about pop culture, not only as entertainment, but also we can absorb them and take as many lessons as we can, and give them other perspectives from our field. So maybe if this discussion reaches to these filmmakers, they're gonna think about what they had been doing in the past. So I think it's really interesting, and not only interesting, but also really important. So thank you very much, guys, for this presentation.
Thank you, Fikri.
Thank you.
Thank you. I always say that it also makes me feel less guilty when I'm watching too much television. Shelley has her hand up. Please ask your question. Hi, Shelley.
I hope you'll forgive me. It's about 5 o'clock in the morning, and so I'm not nearly as put together as I would generally be on a camera. I really love using popular culture as an introduction into indigenous experience. I live on the traditional unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabe territory of the Algonquin First Nation here in Ottawa, Canada. And I have volunteered and have now been tasked for Canada's largest anime convention, which is going to be in May of 2026. This is our 30th anniversary. And I'm putting together an entire program track on anime and manga and First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. So this is going to include a fashion show with ribbon skirts that have The Last Airbender, Grogu, The Mandalorian, painters, artists. I'm going to try and get Andy Everson and his wife out. One of the ones I'm very excited, because there's a lot of reclaiming of traditional art forms that's been going on as a way, no, we're not going to just make a drum, but we're going to start with hunting the moose, killing it, skinning it, using everything, tanning the hide, which takes a year if you're doing it traditionally, and then make the drum, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the most exciting interpretations, and I've seen a lot of really fantastic stuff coming from Canada and the US, quotations, is a Algonquin woman who birch bark is one of their traditional, they still make canoes out of it, baskets, all sorts of things. She spent a year and a half putting together a complete set of Mandalorian armor out of birch bark, patterned it, beaded it, and it was on the Canadian national news because it was just such a. So I want to get her to come. She's actually either Ontario or Manitoba, so middle of the country. I want to get her in to talk about how did that come from, and what does she understand herself as expressing at all these different levels. So I really wanted to thank you and thank Leonie for letting me know about this, so I could, stay up for it, because it's so exciting. Popular culture as a lens to discuss all these things isn't all that common out here. Even though one of my colleagues just this coming semester, there will be 1,200 people online, Max, for his Taylor Swift in popular culture and music course.
Yeah.
But I wanted to thank the presenters. It's all wonderful. I'm of the era where we were Star Trek fans were Trekkers and not Trekkies, just to date myself.
I'm a
And
Trekker.
all three presentations were fantastic, and you've got my juices going. So I, two thumbs up, and thank you to all
Thank
three.
you.
And thank you for staying, getting up so early for this. So thank you.
No, I'm about to go to sleep.
Oh, okay. Good to hear. Well, thank you everybody for coming tonight. David, we've got one last slide to show, I believe.
Yeah.
We're still nailing down the last few presentations for the year, but we do have a couple forthcoming. But we will be advertising. But we've definitely locked in September and November. And Alex Birchmore from ANU is going to talk about more than human maritime encounters and the cynicization of the Temasek wreck. And then Natalie Pearson's going to speak in November. And she's on a topic yet to be, we've yet to have the title. But thank you all so much for making the time to come tonight. Thank you to my colleagues for absolutely wonderful papers. And thank you for sharing my passion for all things science fiction. So good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
It's a pleasure. Thank you, everyone.